Look, I'd like to begin today by acknowledging that this meeting is being held on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay respect to elders past and present and recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land, which continue to be important to these people living today. I'd also like to extend my acknowledgements to the Indigenous people from countries overseas in which our guests work and live on today. Thank you for joining us today. Before I pass on over to our webinar co-host, the eSafety Commissioner, for introductions and their presentation, I'm Charles Huang, Director of Public Policy and Government Relations at the Interactive Games and Entertainment Association, IGEA. My colleagues here today on the panel include Lucy Liu, the Policy Manager, and we've got some others as well in the audience today too. For those who aren't aware, IGEA is the peak industry association representing the video games industry in Australia and New Zealand. Our members include developers, publishers, distributors of video games, as well as makers of the most popular games platforms, consoles and devices. These range in size from small emerging independent studios to some of the largest video games companies in the world. And that's represented in our audience today, both within and outside of our membership. And we note there are several attendees from overseas across different time zones, as well as those who are attending locally. We've had requests on whether this webinar will be recorded, and we can confirm that it will be, especially for the benefit of those who couldn't make it to this webinar. We'd also like to thank the safety team for reaching out to us and offering to provide a webinar ahead of the Phase 2 Industry Online Safety Codes, now known as the Age-Restricted Material Codes, particularly with their recent release of supporting regulatory guidance. Well, look, we hope you find this webinar informative. To make it as meaningful as possible, there was a questionnaire form that was circulated prior to the webinar in case you had any questions, but there's also an opportunity throughout this webinar as well for you to ask questions. There should be a Zoom Q&A feature as part of this webinar if you have any questions. Lucy, my colleague Lucy, and I will assist eSafety in moderating these questions as well. Lucy, was there anything that I haven't touched upon that I missed that I should cover? Nope.
No,
okay.
we can keep going.
Thanks. Well, in that case, I'll pass over to our friends at eSafety for their introductions. Thanks.
Thank you, Charles. My name's Ashley Katz. I'm the Manager of Industry Supervision here at eSafety. A big thank you to IGEA for joining with us today and giving us the opportunity to speak with those people from industry. We look forward to sharing some information and hearing some questions from you. I'll hand over to my colleague.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Chloe Bennett. I'm the manager of one of the online safety codes teams at eSafety, the team that focuses on the age-restricted material codes that we'll be speaking about a bit today. We are the team that have worked quite closely with IGEA and other industry bodies during the development of the codes and fulfilling our legislative role in consulting on the development of the codes. So I'd like to echo Ashley's thanks to them for co-hosting with us today and also for being so collaborative throughout the entire code drafting process. And I'll pass to Jess.
Thanks, Chloe. My name's Jess Olson. I'm the acting manager of our unlawful material online safety codes and standards team. So what would be previously known as the Phase 1 codes and standards. Just here to answer any questions in the Q&A should those requirements come up. I'll throw back to Ashley or Chloe.
Okay, we're ready to start. So as many of you will know, eSafety is Australia's independent regulator for online safety, and our purpose is to make sure Australians have safe experiences online, especially children. And we focus our work under the three, what we call the three complementary pillars. They are prevention, protection, proactive and systemic change. So the prevention pillar is where we educate people and provide resources so they stay safe online. And that's about preventing the harm before it happens. And that encompasses in-house research capability and education and training programs. The second pillar is protection, and that encompasses our regulatory and complaint schemes so that we can act quickly when needed. And the final pillar is the proactive and systemic change. So this is where we work with industry to drive the tech sector to take more responsibility and to bake in those safety protections at the start through initiatives like Safety by Design. So this slide illustrates how all these regulatory schemes work together and with our other functions across eSafety. So at the foundation, as I mentioned, is the Safety by Design initiative, which we encourage all industry, whether you're small, medium or large, to engage with safety by design. And that really is the best prevention method. Next is the co-design mandatory industry codes and the standards which place obligations on industry to be proactive about detection and removal of harmful and illegal content. And it puts the onus on industry to shield children from that harmful content like pornography when they're not emotionally or developmentally ready to access that. Next, we have the basic online safety expectations, which set out the reasonable steps the Australian government expects online service providers to take to ensure that Australians can use all online services safely. And the expectations underpin a transparency scheme where eSafety can require online service providers to report on how they're meeting any or all of the expectations. And finally, at the top, you can see our 4 reporting schemes, and that enables us to protect users from specific harms. So things such as cyberbullying and non-consensual sharing of intimate images. And these schemes provide users with avenues to have this material rapidly removed if it meets the thresholds and really provides support when the harm has occurred. My team, the industry supervision team, is here to ensure that industry compliance comply across all our regulatory schemes. So we're what you might think of as a front door into eSafety across those regulatory schemes. We've worked really closely with some providers to achieve very specific compliance outcomes over a period of time, but with thousands of regulated entities in scope, much of our activity is around this kind of outreach like today's webinar. So we can provide industry with information and help ensure that you can comply with those regulatory schemes. So the Online Safety Act provides for mandatory industry codes, and where a code is not satisfactory, there's a standard, and that covers 8 sections for the online industry. The codes apply to a wide range of online services, including social media platforms, messaging apps, app stores, websites, and hosting services, gaming platforms, email and chat, internet providers, device manufacturers, and AI chatbots, which were recently added due to risks associated with generative AI. So the Unlawful Material Code and Standards focuses on the most serious types of harmful content online, including child sexual abuse material, pro-terror content, extreme crime and violence and drug-related content. There are currently 6 industry codes and 2 standards in force. The codes were drafted by industry, and then the Commissioner has imposed 2 standards where she determined the codes did not sufficiently meet community protection thresholds. The Age-Restricted Material Code addresses other types of harmful content that remain serious, particularly when accessible to children. Priority material under that code includes online pornography, self-harm content, high-impact violence, and simulated gambling. So as you're probably aware, the social media minimum age obligation was passed last year as part of the Online Safety Act amendment, and it's part of a broader strategy to make digital spaces safer for everyone. The social media minimum age obligation places new requirements for certain social media services called age-restricted social media platforms. So there are some key differences between the industry codes and standards and the social media minimum age we just wanted to highlight for you today. They include that the codes and standards focus on access to material and it's material that's defined in the National Classification Scheme, whereas the social media minimum age focuses on raising the minimum age of holding an account on certain types of services. The industry codes are drafted by industry. The industry standards come from eSafety, but the social media minimum age was a law enacted by Parliament. The industry codes are not legislative instruments. The rules made under the social media minimum age about which services may or may not be captured can be scrutinised by Parliament, and industry standards are both legislative instruments. For enforcement under the social media minimum age, eSafety and OAIC, Australia's Information Commissioner, can enforce civil penalties immediately when a breach occurs. For the codes and standards, formal warnings may be issued as a first step. In regards to age assurance, which we'll talk more to today, the social media minimum age requires reasonable steps to prevent age-restricted users from having an account on an age-restricted social media platform, whereas the industry codes require appropriate age assurance to ensure that children are not exposed to Class 2 material across the 8 identified sections of the online industry. And in regards to whether there's a relevant age, the social media minimum age is relevant for 16. So those under 16 cannot hold an account, 16 and over can. Whereas the codes, the age restricted material codes are the relevant age is 18, and in the unlawful material codes, there isn't an age. It's about illegal content, which is relevant to all users of the service. So what was previously known as the Phase 1 codes, we now refer to as the unlawful material codes and standards. And those requirements have obligations for platforms, including gaming services. And just a brief recap, some of those obligations are around the detection of known harmful material. So that includes child sexual abuse material and pro-terror content. The disruption and the deterrence measures for new harmful material, such as child sexual exploitation and pro-terror material. There's generative AI requirements, which is addressing the risks from AI-driven content and services. Safety investment requirements are relevant to platforms allocating resources to their user safety. Staffing and resourcing obligations requiring adequate trust and safety teams. And then user reporting measures with timely investigation and the actioning of user reports. And finally, safety by design requirements, as we mentioned, embedding those safety features really from the outset into products and services. Now I'll hand over to Chloe to take you through the age-restricted material code.
Thanks, Ashley. So the codes we'll be focusing on today are the new age-restricted material codes, formerly known as the Phase 2 codes. So we'll start off with doing sort of an overview of the obligations, which I think sort of one of the key things to take away from this is that there's actually a real similarity between the obligations under the new codes and the pre-existing unlawful material codes and standards. You'll see on the side that investment in resourcing, user reporting, and some of the sort of safety obligations under the codes are very similar across the two sets of codes. One of the big sort of guiding principles of code development was that we were trying to be consistent across regulatory schemes as much as possible, not just across the sort of broader family of codes and standards, but across even some other interrelated regulatory schemes. So we'll talk a little bit about that more, I guess, particularly when we talk about age assurance, but sort of really key things for the ARM codes or the age-restricted material codes are age assurance and safety tools and options about that Class 2 material. And in terms of, I think this is a useful sort of just piece of context, particularly as I know that we have some international attendees in the audience, but the codes have been formally in development since July of last year. Although, as my colleagues at IGEA will attest to, we've been in conversation about them long before that. But really the key date, I think, for the providers on the call today is the 9th of March next year, when most of the codes will come into force. Some of them come into force in December, but those are only the codes relating to search engine services, hosting services, and internet carriage services. So I think the key date for this cohort is the 9th of March. There is one exception to that, which is in relation to the app distribution code, but I'll talk about that when we get to that code later in the presentation. Speaking of the sort of relevant codes that we'll talk about today, so we're really going to try and drill down on the relevant electronic services, designated internet services, app distribution services, and equipment codes today. I will slip into the acronyms of RES, DIS, app, and equipment, so please bear with me. But I think these are most relevant to gaming service providers sort of generally. But I will start by doing a bit of an overview, I think, of some broader reaching obligations, which go across not just these 4 codes, but across all of the codes. So those sort of broader reaching obligations include things like communication and reporting requirements, the trust and safety functions that we've mentioned a few times already, the safety tools, options, and information for end users obligations, and also age assurance measures, which are kind of really one of the only things that are sort of unique to this set of codes compared to the first set of codes. So we'll kick off with a little bit of an overview on the communication and reporting obligations. And I will just say also, actually, we are planning on distributing the slides after the presentation, and as Charles mentioned, it will be recorded. So please don't worry about having to screenshot everything we're putting up today. But I'll point to the sort of summary table that's on the side of the slide here, just to say This table is actually drawn out of the regulatory guidance, which we published last week or the week before. So there's a lot of sort of summary tables like that in the regulatory guidance. While I hope this presentation will be a bit of a whistle stop, taking you to the most relevant things today, I do really encourage you to have a read of the guidance, which does sort of provide a lot of tools like this to point you in the right direction for particular measures. But I will stop spruiking the reg guidance now and talk about these obligations. So again, I think there's sort of some of the key things that we have are risk assessment requirements. I will say that there are fairly limited risk assessment requirements that we're going to talk about today for this cohort of providers. The main one is for app distribution services, but just as a point of interest, across the codes, there are sort of generally powers for eSafety to request information about risk assessments and for higher risk services to conduct those sorts of assessments, particularly as they might pertain to how children can come into contact with Class 2 material on a service. Then we also have updates to eSafety on changes to the service. I know relevant and material might seem quite semantic, but I think the sort of point there is that I guess with the changes to the service that can occur that would significantly change the extent to which a child could come into contact with Class 2 material on a service. Those are the sorts of updates that eSafety would want to be receiving. I guess also in terms of timing for those updates, across the codes, there's just a general obligation to provide the update, but I should say that from my experience of working in the team for a while and across our other regulatory schemes, there are some really positive outcomes when services engage with eSafety early when they're intending to make those sorts of updates. So those are those sorts of obligations across the codes. Then we also have the end user complaints, which we'll talk a little bit more on the next slide, but this really is about there are, under the Act, eSafety has the ability to receive end user complaints that aren't resolved by a service. Generally, the approach under the codes, not just under our codes, but under the unlawful material codes, is that services should be the place where user complaints are received in the first instance. But then if they can't be resolved, then they're passed on to eSafety, who can step in. We don't have an obligation to resolve the complaints, but we can. Then the final thing is compliance reporting. I think the main thing I wanted to point out was compliance reporting, particularly in the new set of codes versus the old, I shouldn't say the old, the pre-existing unlawful material codes and standards, is that there are fewer obligations around timed compliance reports in this new set of codes. Most of the reporting obligations in these codes are on request by eSafety. So that's just something to be aware of, I guess, that eSafety can request a report, but there are fewer sort of those annual reporting obligations that there have been in unlawful material codes and standards. So that's a very broad overview of some of the communication requirements under these codes. And again, so those are sort of the external communication requirements, and this slide is more about the complaints requirements that end users have with services. So again, one of the sort of key things across the codes and standards is that services need to have systems and processes to receive end user complaints. And I think that's particularly important with our codes and standards because Class 2 material is legal content. It is material which adults are entitled to access. So we're not trying to necessarily cut off adults from that material, but we know there are lots of circumstances in which kids can come across that material, and particularly where they come across it accidentally or incidentally, we know that that type of exposure is actually more harmful for children in a lot of circumstances. So I think the complaint schemes are really important in these codes and standards because they sort of account for that idea that the material is kind of out there to an extent, but having the systems and process in place, particularly to protect children, is really important. And users are often best placed to point out to providers where those systems might be failing. So I won't read out the contents of the slide here, but really I think the key takeaways are that complaint systems need to be easy to access. They can't be buried. They need to be available easily to end users. There have to be sort of consistent policies and procedures for how services deal with those complaints, and they must be sort of responded to in a timely way, both in the sense of responding to the end user themselves, and then if you then go on to refer the unresolved complaints to eSafety, also doing that in a prompt way. One of the other overarching things across both of the sets of codes and standards is sort of trust and safety. And I think we talked about safety by design as well above. I don't expect that anything on here would be of a shock to anyone to see in terms of what could be systems that would support having a sort of effective trust and safety function. But maybe one thing I wanted to point to in particular is the continuously improving over time. Because I think that is something that, again, sort of the goal of our codes and standards is just for like systemic improvement. So this is a really key one in terms of how you can demonstrate compliance over time. And I think it's another matter of, you know, in our compliance and enforcement approach, eSafety, we try to be like proportionate, fair, and transparent. Those are some of the 3 pillars of our compliance and enforcement policy. But this is one way to show, I think, particularly for providers of different sizes, how you are moving towards compliance and working to comply with the codes over time. So I think there's a really good example of some of the sort of things you can do to demonstrate continuous improvement in the RES code. Particularly, I think it's in table 11, one of the measures there. So some of the measures actually specifically set out examples of things you can be doing to demonstrate continuous improvement, and to not just demonstrate continuous improvement, but to actually improve. And that includes things like investing in resourcing sufficiently trust and safety teams. So there's actually overlap between those continuous improvement obligations and with some of the other obligations under the code, which all goes towards compliance, which is what we'd like to see. Lucy, I can see you pop your hand up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chloe. Just a question from our end. So in terms of trust and safety functions, how does eSafety envisage these requirements applying to smaller studios with fewer personnel? We'll be pretty keen to hear, and I'm sure many of our members will be interested.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And it's certainly not a question which is unique to the gaming industry. It is something that happens a lot, you know, particularly we all know stories of social media platforms blowing up basically overnight because they go viral or something like that. Look, as I just mentioned, one of the sort of these key principles which guide our compliance and enforcement approach is proportionality, transparency, and fairness. And I think proportionality is the key one there. We really understand that, particularly I think if your service gains a high number of end users in a very, very short period of time, that you do need time to resource functions and to comply in a way which is, you know, proportionate with your risk profile under the codes. I think that's the other thing, is that we'll get to this a little bit, but the codes are really risk-based in terms of the sort of generally the approach to things you have to do. So it would really only be if your service approached a new risk profile in terms of the exposure of children to class 2 material, that would be, you would have new obligations to comply with anyway. But, you know, I think, again, it would be a case of making contact, trying to sort of like assess where you're at as an organization. You know, one phrase that comes up a lot across the codes is taking reasonable steps or taking appropriate actions. So there is, you know, obviously it can be the case that, yes, you might not be there yet as a studio or as a developer or as a provider, but what we want to be seeing is that you're taking the steps and you're, you know, taking into account where you might be as a service provider, and that you're improving over time, I think is a key thing. We certainly wouldn't be, you know, kicking down the door day one, particularly if you are, you know, I think the key example there would be if you were a service that, you know, had gained a large number of users over a very, very short period of time and needed time to spin up the sort of proportionate functions.
Thanks, Chloe.
No problem. And please do keep the questions coming. Really want this to be as useful as possible to everyone who's attending today. We'll just cover off again the sort of safety tools, options, and information for end users. So I think that's a key thing, is that some of these obligations actually extend further than just for child end users. These are for end users generally. One of the principles in the code development process, and this was actually also in the formal matters that were issued to industry for the development of codes, was kind of the idea that if safety tools are being made available for children, they should also be offered to adults on an opt-in basis. So we see that pop up across a few of the codes. I think probably the most relevant code for that might be in the equipment code, where you have restricted user accounts, but I'll come back to that later. But some of the sort of overarching obligations in respect of the safety tools, options, and information. The first one there is about information accessibility. So I guess that's very relevant, related to the sort of complaints approach, which is that information about safety tools and options needs to be easily accessible to end users. And I think another element of that, which is in the codes, is that it needs to also be suitable to the demographic of people who might be accessing their information. And I guess the most relevant demographic for the purpose of these codes and standards is children. So I guess plain language, easy to understand policies and information, having that, like, I know a lot of services already do this, which is great to see, having sort of child-friendly versions of policies. But that is something that is built into the codes. The sort of follow on from that is then not just having the information about the safety tools, but also making those tools available. So there are a number of obligations about making sure that end users, again, it's not just a matter of keeping kids away from that material, but making sure that adults who don't want to see that material have the option to do that. And that, I think, is most prevalent in the res code across the codes we're going to be talking about today. But also, again, as I mentioned, in the equipment code. Finally, we also have this like link to other services, which comes up, I guess, particularly when we talk about not the necessarily online pornography, but some of the other material we deal with as a priority material with the age-restricted codes is self-harm material, self-harm, suicide, and material which instructs and promotes in disordered eating, which is obviously highly sensitive material where really our priority is making sure that people who might be searching for that material can get help. So that's why this becomes really important, and sort of directing out to subject matter experts who might be able to provide that help or provide things like hotlines, directories, that sort of thing. I think, for example, in the Australian context, one of those service providers would probably be like Kids Helpline. So those are sort of the overarching obligations around safety tools. But again, I think a lot of them link back to some of the pre-existing obligations around improvement and resourcing of trust and safety functions as well. And finally, we have age assurance, which has really been on everyone's lips for the last couple of weeks and months. So as Ashley mentioned, we do have sort of, and I say this sort of in comparison to the social media minimum age, the social media minimum age has reasonable steps to check age, whereas we have appropriate age assurance. But I would say that the sort of difference in namings is a bit misleading, because the principles which eSafety has adopted in terms of what appropriate and reasonable looks like generally for age assurance are the same. And actually, if you've been involved in the code drafting process since the beginning, if you read the regulatory guidance which was issued by eSafety about the social media minimum age, you would have seen the terms technically accurate, robust, reliable, and fair, which are the exact terms used even in the draft codes back when they were still being considered by the commissioner. So those principles carry across sort of eSafety's general principle-based approach to what sort of best way to do age assurance is. And I think the key thing is that it's actually quite flexible, the approach that has been reached in the codes, and again, very proportionate to the sort of risk level of a service. I think those four things are sort of the guiding stars of what age assurance should be achieving if you are required to implement it under the codes. As I've got on the slide there, eSafety doesn't mandate that a particular type of age assurance needs to occur. I've extracted one of the clauses from the head terms on the left-hand side of the slide there, which sets out examples of what could be forms of appropriate age assurance. But that is not an exhaustive list. So really, it's a lot of the things that you would expect to be there, but it is not the sort of totality of what you can do under the codes. I think the other thing to note there, probably the most important thing that sort of moves away from general industry practice right now is that self-declaration will not be sufficient. Lucy.
Thanks, Chloe. So question from our end. When discussing age assurance, the topic of VPNs and other forms of circumvention is often raised. Since the eSafety Commission expects service providers to implement age assurance that is reasonably resistant to circumvention, how will eSafety evaluate the effectiveness of these measures under the Age Restricted Materials Code?
Sure, that's a great question. It's on the slide there, but I think it's also useful to just say, one big difference, and particularly as I know we have some international attendees today, a big difference in the way we're approaching age assurance versus, I guess, particularly the UK, where they have their highly effective age assurance threshold, is that there's no sort of like hard cutoff for a percentage of efficacy which needs to be in place. It's really, again, meant to be proportionate to the actual risk of the service in terms of what measure is implemented. I think the thing with VPNs, and we talk about this a bit in our regulatory guidance and also in the social media minimum age regulatory guidance, but Appendix F of our regulatory guidance is where we speak about this, is that we know that there's lots of information that services can use aside from VPNs to determine the location of end users. The key thing, I think the most relevant terms there are technically accurate and robust. So, it's a really, I think VPN usage is obviously, it's a very well-known circumvention method, but we know that there are ways to determine that end users might be using a VPN or might be circumventing the system. And there are expectations to try and prevent circumvention wherever possible. I guess just in terms of how we're monitoring it though, eSafety has lots of ways of monitoring compliance with its various regulatory functions. I think one of the key things is that we have information gathering powers, both within the codes. As I mentioned before, we can request information about things like risk assessments. There's also information gathering powers in the actual act, which relate to how the codes relate to compliance with the codes. We also, just might often voluntarily seek information from service providers to see how things are working. I guess particularly one of those things might be around continuous improvement. I would say that continuous improvement would include things like making sure that your systems are resistant to circumvention. And actually in some of the codes we're going to talk about today, particularly the RES code, that's actually a specific requirement. So you need to be improving age assurance systems over time. Finally, actually some of the most common ways that we get information about where systems might be circumvented or not working is from the public. So we have our codes complaint scheme where we can receive direct complaints from the public about non-compliance with codes. So we also have a sort of inquiries box where we just receive, it's sort of our general front door where people will send us information and we can have a look at things. We also have our the reporting schemes under our investigations branch, which relate to all sorts of different types of material, but information often comes through that way as well. So there's a number of different ways in which we can monitor compliance. We get information from a lot of different places, including directly from industry, but also from the public, I think is another key input for us. And I guess particularly at the moment, given the way, I guess particularly with the rollout of the social media minimum age, we are receiving a lot of outreach from the public about how these systems are working right now. I can also see another question has just come up. If there's any, but maybe I'll wrap up this slide first so that we can take a little bit of a break. Really the only other thing I wanted to say about age assurance requirements is that it's littered all throughout the head terms, but you must always remain in compliance with the Privacy Act, no matter what you're doing. The Privacy Act is the relevant piece of legislation for privacy requirements in Australia. So we need to, and that is not just the Privacy Act, I should say, but it's also the Australian Privacy Principles. And also you might be aware that the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner is currently developing the Children's Online Privacy Code. So that's expected to be in place by the end of next year. And so that could have some really relevant requirements, I think, for providers of services where children are accessing them. But that is something that has sort of been happening in parallel to our own code development process. So that's just something to be aware of, I think, as the codes come into force in 2026.
Yep, so we received a question through Q&A. So the question reads, games are typically provided via game platforms. What is eSafety's view of game developers relying solely on the platform's age assurance steps to ensure only players that are accessing a game are of the appropriate age, rather than a game developer implementing their own separate age assurance step within the game?
That is a great question. So, and actually, you know, this is something that is dealt with in the head terms of the codes. So we are well aware that there will be opportunities for the sharing of age signals across the technology stack. And that's something that we really wanted to see taken into account during the code development process. So there's actually, we would, in some circumstances, encourage the sharing of age signals across related services or interconnected services. There's a number of examples where this can already occur. Like, I think the one that really springs to my mind for me is in the last couple of months, I think both of the major app stores have just announced that they have the ability to share age range or through their wallet functions or through centralized user accounts. So that's a really big opportunity for the sharing of age signals. But I think most crucially for this question is that our view on it is that it is an appropriate form of age assurance. So I think it's particularly in, I hope I don't get this wrong, clause 5.1c subsection V of the head terms expressly recognizes that where an age signal is shared between services, so long as that original point of age signal is appropriate age assurance, that the sharing of that signal is also appropriate. So eSafety, I don't think, definitely doesn't take the position that it needs to be done each time on each service. The sharing of signals is actually, I think, desirable in a lot of cases to reduce the number of times that users need to be entering discrete information. But one really key principle with that is that where age signals are shared, there is actually also in the head terms, in relation to appropriate age assurance, a requirement to make sure that the data sharing is minimized, so that it's only really shared for the purpose of conducting appropriate age assurance and for no other reason, I think, is the approach eSafety has taken, an industry has taken in the head terms. But yes, the sharing is expressly recognized as an appropriate form of age assurance. And I hope that has actually answered the question, but Lucy, please tell me if it hasn't.
Yeah, no, I think you've covered it off really well. Thanks, Chloe.
Great. All right. So that is sort of the broad spectrum of some of the overarching requirements across each of the codes. Now we're going to dive into some of the requirements and some of the individual codes. So we'll kick off with the RES code because that is the one that specifically refers to online gaming services as being within its scope. And RES, I should say, relevant electronic services, is one of two sort of catch-all categories that exist in the Online Safety Act. So I think as sort of just useful context is that RES also applies to things like messaging services, dating services, and a number of other sort of communication services, I think, is the key thing. But online gaming services captured in there. And again, just as some further context, the way that different gaming services are dealt with in the RES code is there's a division between services that have communications functionality and those with limited communications functionality. So I won't read out what's on the slide here, but I think the sort of key thing, particularly with limited communications functionality gaming services, is that there's actually a really broad range of what limited communications functionality looks like. So it's not just a matter of can you message or speak to another player or not. There are sort of a very broad things that are captured within limited communications functionality. And that's going to be more relevant when we talk about the DIS code in a second, but just wanted to point it out there. We'll kick off with a sort of discussion about overarching requirements for both of these types of gaming services. And this is a good segue from the previous slide, which I didn't actually think about, but age assurance is sort of the key obligation that applies to both. So the thing, I mean, again, as you can see it on the slide, But if a game is or would likely be classified R18 plus under the Classification Act because it constitutes simulated gambling material or is otherwise classified R18 plus, you have to do appropriate age assurance, and you have to monitor the effectiveness of those steps over time. This is not just for the res code, but maybe just an observation I can make about the way games have been approached in the codes generally, is that really we have relied wherever possible on pre-existing ratings and classifications, recognizing, of course, that a lot of games go through the classification process, classified using a classification tool, or are distributed through app stores which have their own rating systems. So that's why I think, this is just one example. We can point at things that are classified R18 plus and point to them as being, okay, these are specifically identified as pieces of material that are aimed and meant for adults. So that's where it's appropriate to do age assurance. And that comes across, I think, in basically all of the codes, which we're going to talk about today as well. And again, I think probably the only sort of point of fuzziness there is that with simulated gambling material is it is or would likely be classified R18 plus. So I think that means it's not necessarily that it has been classified R18 plus, but it would likely be if you were to put it through the classification process. But again, that only applies to the simulated gambling material. Otherwise, it only applies if you are actually classified R18 plus. And apart from that, there are no risk assessment requirements. It's really, again, the risk assessment has already occurred because you have already gone through the classification process. And we'll talk a little bit about the services with communications functionality first. So the key sort of unique provision, I think, for these services is about sharing material which relates to non-consensual sharing of intimate images, grooming of children, or sexual extortion, and having terms and conditions around the sharing of those types of material. One thing it's important to say up top is that none of the things in the new sets of codes supplants any of the responsibilities the industry might have under the unlawful material codes and standards. And I say that here because, as a lot of you are probably no doubt aware, under the RES standard for unlawful material, there are already proactive requirements for services to disrupt and deter the sharing of child sexual exploitation material. So nothing in there supplants anything here. I guess we recognize that there could be potentially overlap between some types of the material, but this is really more of a sort of catch-all approach to this particularly harmful type of class 2 material, which may not be captured under the unlawful material standard. So that's just one thing I really wanted to flag there. But that's really the sort of only unique requirement in terms of the sort of activity that needs to be have measures applied to it under the RES code for these sorts of services. Other than that, there's a very brief summary of some of the broader obligations below, which include a lot of the things I've already spoken about above. And for those services with limited communications functionality, as you can imagine, there are then even fewer obligations because those services are more locked down. Again, it's really more around just sort of reporting and compliance tools and having complaints tools, which are sort of broad requirements across all services under the code. And again, just a reminder that some of these measures even then only apply to those services which are specifically already rated R18 plus. So they're not general requirements in the first place. I just wanted to check if there were any questions there before we move on to the DIS code.
We had a question come in via Q&A.
Yeah.
I'm happy to read out loud.
Yeah, go.
Just to be clear, if an unclassified game does not have simulated gambling, but is likely to be classified R18 plus for other reasons, bracket, violence, drug use, etc., would age assurance be required?
No. The would likely be requirement only applies to simulated gambling. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm using the air quotes a lot. Please bear with me. Thanks for that question. With that, we might move on to the DIS code, and I'll make this discussion of the DIS code really brief, just because DIS is, again, another one of our sort of catch-all categories in the Online Safety Act, but it is, I think, should be sort of thought of as really the code of last resort, where a service doesn't neatly fit into a definition elsewhere. In particular, I think for RES, and not that it's so relevant to this cohort of providers today, but SMS, you actually can't be both a RES and an SMS and a DIS. It is specifically carved out from each other. So we're really only talking about the DIS code today as a bit of a fallback for services that might not quite fit into those definitions in the RES. The DIS code might still apply, but in really limited circumstances. So again, I think because of the way the definitions are in the RES code, particularly because they relate to games where you play with other end users, obviously that leaves single player games out there in the open, but it would only relate to those games insofar as they have an online functionality and no communications functionality. So I think when you think about that sort of combination of factors, that leaves a very, very small sort of segment of products that might be captured. But just for completeness, we're still going to talk about it a little bit today. And I think the other, and in terms of the approach that's to classified DIS, and we call them classified DIS in the DIS code, again, recognizing that a lot of these products have probably already gone through the classification process, the requirements are really similar. So it's about games it's a focus on games that have been classified R18 plus or would likely be classified R18 plus. The thing that's different between this and the RES code is that it does actually, this is a great link back to that question just then. It's the would or would likely be classified actually does extend beyond the simulated gambling thing for these types of games. But again, I really emphasize, I think this would be a very, very small sort of cohort of games, and probably, again, would be really the sort of definition of last resort when we're looking at things that are provided. That said, we'll still very briefly touch on the requirements for classified DIS and for these sorts of games. So again, there is an age assurance requirement. Must provide appropriate age assurance measures before providing access to simulated gambling material, really similar to the RES code. And also the requirement to access to test and monitor the effectiveness of age assurance measures over time. For broader types of these sorts of products, there's actually not a strict age assurance requirement, I would say. There is this requirement to have appropriate measures to limit the risk of child end users accessing or being exposed to other Class 2 material, but it's not an express age assurance requirement. I think implementing age assurance would help you easily meet that requirement, but it is not an express age assurance requirement. And that applies, again, to services that are rated R18 plus, but are not simulated gambling material. I won't linger on DIS just because it is the sort of code of last resort. But if there's any questions, please stop me and let me know. Other than that, we might move on to the App Distribution Services Code quickly. So I'm aware that there's probably some people on the call today who provide game storefronts online, which would fall into the remit of the App Distribution Services Code. As I mentioned earlier, this is one of the codes where there is a risk assessment requirement. I would say it's not a strict requirement, but it would be, I think, if you're attempting to comply with the code, probably very helpful for you to do a risk assessment, because as I'll speak to in just a second, it basically determines whether or not you need to do age assurance on your service. So it will be like basically the first thing that we as a regulator would be asking for if you chose not to implement age assurance. But I've just put on the slide there a few of the things that are included in the things in the risk assessment requirements in the code, including, I think, as you would expect, about like the likelihood that an Australian child would access an adult app. As you can see on the side of the slide there, an adult app is an app that is rated R18 plus. But on the next slide, I think we'll talk a little bit about the actual requirements, which is that, so if you are a high risk app store after conducting a risk assessment, You have to implement appropriate age assurance before end user can purchase or download adult apps. And again, so this really is about, like, if an app is clearly rated R18 plus and is intended for adults, making sure that it's only adults who are actually accessing it. And I think, you know, there are some related measures there which sort of go towards making sure that that is the case, including making sure that you have clear content ratings. Providers have to display age and content ratings, and also the age ratings must be appropriate. There are ways where there are provisions in the code where eSafety can sort of talk to a provider about an app rating not being an appropriately rated app, for example, and steps that a provider then has to take in conjunction with the individual developer to make sure that that is resolved. There's also general requirements around policies for app ratings, and also, as with all of the other codes, continuous improvement measures for safety measures and making sure that information is available to end users about safety tools. And finally, we'll wrap up with equipment to leave a little bit of time for questions at the end. So under the equipment code, there are 3 tiers of devices. Tier 1 is, I guess, the highest risk tier, down to, it's not called tier 3, but it's the other tier of sort of what are the lowest risk devices. And without sort of reading out everything on the slide there, really a lot of the sort of thinking around what makes a device high risk is whether or not it has a general internet browsing capability and whether or not it's portable and personal. So, you know, it can be used away from adult supervision, I think, is the key thing there. And a lot of this thinking was also informed by research which eSafety did earlier this year about the sort of extent to which children in particular use particular devices and have access to different devices. You know, I think the interactive devices tier is really focused on the sort of high rates that we know children use smartphones and tablets. In terms of the actual requirements in the equipment code, what it really comes down to, I think, is like allowing users to set up appropriate environments for the users of those devices. So for tier 1 devices, one of the key requirements is making sure that users can set up child and restricted accounts. So child accounts, slightly different from restricted accounts. They apply for users 13 years and under, and then restricted accounts apply for users 18 years and under, but they have similar sort of requirements that if you are using one of those accounts, you need to have default settings, particularly around the extent to which a user would be exposed to online pornography while that type of account is being used. I think this already reflects a lot of common safety tools that are already employed, particularly by, I guess, smartphone providers, but it just codifies the requirement to have those sorts of options available to users. One key thing to highlight is that there is no hard age assurance requirement for the equipment code. This is all really based on an opt-in system, but it is, as you'll see, there are also other sort of, I think, harder requirements about making sure adult users can adjust settings and have control over to the extent those settings are used. One thing that we hear a lot is like the extent to which child end users can basically circumvent the safety defaults which are put in place. One other thing I'll point out is that second dot point there, which is about sharing of information across where an OS provider, and sorry, I should say OS provider, operating system provider. Operating systems are captured under the equipment code. So where an operating system provider also provides like services on an operating system, not just the actual operating system itself, there are obligations for age signals to be shared. So just going back to that earlier question, it's not actually even, it is actually a proactive obligation. It's not just a matter of the sharing of age signals where possible. It's not just an option, particularly for the equipment providers. They need to sort of proactively engage in that practice. And really quickly, for the other two tiers, again, I think a lot of these requirements we've spoken about at a high level today already. I'll leave you with the useful resources slide, but really maybe I'll just take the opportunity to open the floor to questions and just say, please visit our website, read our regulatory guidance. I think a lot of those materials are really helpful, but other than that, very happy to take questions now.
Thank you so much, Chloe, for the effort. Please take a breather. And attendees, feel free to send your questions via Q&A, and the eSafety team will answer your questions if you have any. I don't see any questions in Q&A. I'll pass it over to Charles for final remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy, and thanks so much, Chloe and Ash and the rest of the eSafety team for look, initially reaching out to us to offer to do this presentation. I should have mentioned up front, and providing you know, members and others with an update of particularly focus on the online games industry and how the new phase 2 codes, now the age restricted material codes, apply, and also giving a bit of a refresh from the phase 1 codes and standards. Hopefully it's been useful to everyone who's attended, and thank you for those who joined us, particularly from overseas, knowing your different time zones as well. Chloe and team, was there anything you want to say to close off the webinar?
Charles, if we can just say thank you again for having us. Obviously, this is a webinar for today, but we anticipate continued engagement with your members and others. So do feel free to reach out to eSafety at industry@esafety.gov.au if you think of questions after, or if you want to discuss in a more one-to-one environment. So hopefully you found it useful for today.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. And yeah, if there's nothing else, we will close this webinar. And thank you, and hope everyone has a good break as well. See you later.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.